Top of the morning, Dan and Amy. Last hour we talked a good bit about school openings and all the related issues and the arguments. We sort of framed it by offering up this grand bargain that was proposed by Bill Galston in the Wall Street Journal, allowing older and particularly vulnerable teachers to do distance education, distance instruction, and giving all teachers who are in the classroom hazard pay for the duration of the pandemic, health insurance coverage, to press them into service the same way that other workers were pressed into service during the pandemic, during the height of it, frontline workers in grocery stores and in other areas as well. And whether or not that's a deal that the teachers would make. And it doesn't seem like a deal that a lot of big city teachers' unions want to make.
No.
But perhaps some individual teachers. Our friend Libby Emmons over at the Post Millennial argues that that's obviously important. It's a predicate to the larger conversation about the kind of education that is available when schools are open. How are your children being educated? And now with parents having to be engaged in a battle to get their kids back to school, at least for the great majority of the 51 million parents with kids in public schools in this country, perhaps they should maintain that engagement and take a closer look at the instruction their kids are getting when school is up and running, just as some parents were starting to get a handle on it even in the last part of the last semester, the spring semester, during the remote learning. For more on this, again, we're pleased to be joined by Libby Emmons. She is a senior editor at the Post Millennial. Libby, thanks for joining us. Appreciate it.
Sure. Thanks for having me.
So give us the handle on New York City schools where you're at, because, what New York City does, a lot of other big cities follow. And de Blasio is not taking as strident a position, somewhat surprisingly, as the teachers' unions in places like L.A. and Chicago are at present, with some form of in-person instruction in the proposal he rolled out earlier in the week. And so where does that stand with New York City between de Blasio and the unions and the parents?
Well, for the most part, it's a little bit confusing. So de Blasio has come up with this plan where parents can send kids back to school for maybe 1 or 2 days a week of education in the classroom, or they can opt out of that and do entirely remote learning. Teachers also have been given, I believe, an option to be remote educators or to be back in the classroom. This is supposedly to ensure the safety of those teachers that are older than 65. I believe the majority of teachers in New York City are under that age. I know that many of the teachers in my son's school are, 30s, 20s, 30s, maybe 40s. So this is sort of this not plan that has been devised by the city, which leaves so much up for grabs. Also, in this past semester with remote learning, even though we have 1.1 million New York City school students, and we have so many public schools, and it's such a huge component of our budget and everything else, the way that remote learning was rolled out was different for every school. There wasn't one consistent standard. So earlier in the pandemic, there wasn't anything, and then mostly there were phone calls with teachers video phone calls with teachers just to check in. A lot of the learning that was being done was basically just a list of assignments that were given without really any instruction for the parents to understand how to teach these lessons, or, which left me, and I'm sure many other parents, trying to teach math in a way that we learned it when we were kids, which is not the way that it's taught now for reasons that I also don't understand. But yeah, so it's pretty topsy-turvy. I know that parents that I've talked to a lot of parents I've talked to want their kids to go back to school. And these are parents in my community, mostly minority parents, who are interested in making sure that their kids get a decent education. I've talked to a lot of parents who are more affluent, who are mostly concerned with the health and well-being of their kids and saying that they don't want their kids to go back to school. And what I think is really interesting, too, is my community, certainly in New York City, and the people that I've known are mostly leftist, are mostly liberal. And these are the same people that have been saying to us for decades that what's most important in this country is educating our youth and making sure that kids have a good sense of their potential and their future. What are we doing now? Are we so cowed with fear that we're willing to sacrifice the education of our kids? It just seems crazy to me.
And this, the CDC has issued guidelines for schools reopening that's saying masking is necessary. If things could go back to normal and if masks are so safe, I'd wear one in my sleep just to get things back to normal. But do you think
Sure.
that's got to be one of the protocols if New York does go back at all, correct?
I believe that that's part of it, masking. There's also a lot of hand sanitizers. Schools are being cleaned, I believe, more rigorously, as are the New York City subways. So that's a blessing for everybody. But yeah, I know also that in the spring there were daycare centers that were open at the Y. I was reading about this. It was on NPR in Arizona and also in New York. Daycare centers were open. They used masking. They used hand sanitizer and the 6 feet rule and things like that. And there was a remarkably low number of people that got sick. It was like, I don't know, I don't want to quote it, but it was hardly anybody got sick using these methods. And this was for essential workers, so that essential workers could have
Right.
have something for their kids to do.
Oh, yeah. My friend in Minnesota, she's had 70 kids in her school this entire time, and they do not have one case of COVID. And it's been 70
Right.
kids, and they, if they take your temperature on the way in, if it's 100.4 or higher, you go home. And they've only sent one kid
Right.
home, and that person was, isolated for 7 days or whatever. And that's it. They've had no cases at all. So that's a good example. And they're not wearing masks either.
Yeah, I think that there's a lot that we can learn from the experiment that we played with essential workers and their children this past spring. And if essential workers need a place to put their children, the same can be said that children need a place to go.
Right.
Sitting at home and looking at screens and trying to conduct an educational life, an intellectual life, and a social life through these devices that for years parents have been saying, no screen time, you have to just read for 20 minutes before you have screen time or whatever. Negotiations parents put into place, and now we're forcing kids to sit there and stare at their computers for hours at a time. It's the only way to talk to friends. Parents are afraid of, play dates and meeting up at parks or whatever else. So, yeah, I just think that I think that we're listening to these talking points in a very partisan way, and I don't think it's benefiting anybody. When I've talked to people I know, they're saying you're just repeating Trump and Betsy DeVos talking points about, why we should open schools. And I'm like, no, I'm looking at my kid who is
Right.
bored to tears.
Oh, I know.
Who doesn't,
Yeah.
I have 2 of them,
parents
too.
all know this. It's insanity to just watch these brains decay and, inside these kids. They're just so terribly bored.
Yeah, you bring up a good point too. All the studies, and we had talked about in this show often the studies that were piling up that show how damaging excess screen time was to a child's intellectual development, and we would talk about that. And and now everything is in full reverse because of the anxiety of the adults, as you're suggesting. But perhaps the adults should be additionally anxious, as you write, about what's being taught, whether it's on a screen or in a classroom in these schools, and with their newfound engagement at a level perhaps they hadn't been engaged before. Now's perhaps a time to be more introspective about all things related to their kids' education.
I think that's a great point. And I think that here in New York, we see the New York City mayor, Bill de Blasio, going out there, participating in protests, advocating for the First Amendment rights of some people and not for others. What kind of message is this? Like, this is what's going on. It's okay for some people to, get what they need, and it's not okay for everybody else. With the church closures and the side by side with the protests, which, as a practicing Catholic, I just find infuriating. It's just crazy. But yeah, there is also, as you mentioned, Dan, there's a level of indoctrination going on with kind of ideology that has skated under the radar for many years, which I saw coming up in the theater community, and it was certainly present there. It was certainly present in undergrad and grad school. But to see the way that anti-racism education is being taught in the lower grades, I think it's very divisive to set up some children to be pitied and as victims, and to set up other children to be shamed as being oppressors. I don't think it does anything worthwhile for kids or their level of self-consciousness or their confidence, rather, or their ability to form lasting relationships when you're constantly looking at people across the divide that society tells you exists between you. How are you supposed to make friendships? How are you supposed to, build a society from this mess that we've got at our feet right now?
They're like socially, they're unstable right now. They don't know. It's just awful.
Yeah, but the curriculum here.
Okay.
Look, I mean, parents need to be on the lookout for Robin DiAngelo's White Fragility making its way into their kids' curriculum. John McWhorter, excellent piece in The Atlantic on this, where he says,
that was spectacular.
Yeah, John McWhorter.
Yeah.
I've learned that one of America's favorite advice books, because it's a #1 bestseller right now, one of America's favorite advice books of the moment is actually a racist tract. Despite the sincere intentions of its author, the book diminishes black people in the name of dignifying us. And this is a fight that needs to be taken up by parents, black, white, and everything, and every other color under the rainbow at the K through 12 level, because you're going to see her work. You're going to see Ibram Kendi's work. You're going to see 1619 being shoehorned into your kids' education. And as you use the word indoctrination at the outset of the conversation, that's exactly what's happening. And it will happen if parents don't, if parents aren't cognizant of the curriculum that's being advanced.
Yes, I think that's absolutely right. Obviously, there's nothing wrong with teaching about racism and teaching the difficult past of American history. That's part of who we are. That's part of what we come from. And there's nothing wrong with that. What is incorrect is teaching kids that there are differences between them based on skin color. It just doesn't make any sense saying that white families always pass racism down to their children, even if they don't know it. It's as though there's nothing you can do about it. It makes these kids powerless. And it also victimizes, I think, black children. It tells them that, there are all of these things stacked against them that they can never overcome. And I don't know how, in any way, that's an empowering statement. That seems like something that's remarkably defeatist to me and infantilizing, to assume that kids who face obstacles can't overcome them. Our entire history of American heroes is about kids who face obstacles and overcome them. Every superhero is a poor orphan, well, except for Bruce Wayne, he's a rich orphan. But
Right.
You see my point. Like, everybody is like, that's our story. Our story is, I was set up from birth with, nothing, and it was devastating and difficult, and I overcame and I achieved. Bill Clinton talks about he was the child of a single mother. Barack Obama faced his difficulties. This is what it is to be an American. You face your obstacles. You work hard to overcome them. When you fail, you try again. That's the deal. And now we're told that even that, I don't know if you saw, the Smithsonian has these posters now
we
about
talked about it. Yeah.
how all this stuff is overcoming obstacles apparently is racist now. Like, it's white supremacy apparently to take charge of your own potential and do something with your life. That's just such a cruel thing to say to children who are, America's youth is obviously our future. We've been saying this for so long, and this has for so long been a leftist missive. And I think that the time has come for parents who did not subscribe to this kind of ideology to stand up for their kids, to stand up for the public education system, and to stand up for America's youth and say, this is not who we are. We are a people. We are united. We are together in working toward a beautiful future for a democratic America. Why would we not want that?
She is Libby Evans. She is a senior editor at the Post Millennial. Libby, thanks for joining us again. Appreciate it.
Thanks so much.
Thanks. And she joined us on our turnkey.pro answer line.
The more you